Painter Chuck Close famously said, "Inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us just show up and get to work." Most people think that finding inspiration is hard. But the truth is that having the stamina to keep showing up to make your art is harder. If you do that, the inspiration will come. Welcome to the Passionate Painter Podcast. I'm your host, Caroline Italia Carlson. Whether your art is a full-time career or your side gig, if you are passionate about creating art, this podcast is for you. Don't worry about taking notes. I'll do that for you. And you can find them at passionatepainterpodcast.com. I'm excited to share with you my interview with Portuguese artist Nelson Ferreira. Nelson studied fine arts painting and has exhibited and taught internationally. He is a visiting lecturer for the National Portrait Gallery, National Gallery of Lisbon, Universidade Autónoma de Lisboa, and many other museums and artistic institutions, where he teaches both beginner and advanced levels, including courses on historical painting methods specifically tailored for restorers. Nelson created and runs classes in the Saatchi Gallery, V&A Museum, Chiswick Business Park, Regent Street Crown Estates, and Grosvenor. He's just been awarded a diploma for his continuous research on medieval painting methods, and he's now preparing to advance for his Ph.D. at the Prince's Foundation on the topic of 15th century primitive Flemish oil painting techniques. Nelson resides in London. The interview ran a bit long, so I've broken it into 2 episodes. Part 2 is available now at passionatepainterpodcast.com and all the major podcast directories. Welcome to the show. I'm so grateful that you've taken the time to speak with me so late at night across the pond.
Absolutely. It's not too late, actually. I'm noctivagous at heart. I tend to wake up after 9 p.m., in my heart. But as I get older, it's changing. I'm starting to get sleepier and sleepier by the time I was not like that 5 years ago, but
yes.
Yeah.
I used to be too. I used to be very much, but now not so much. I have now children and, now I just try to get as much sleep as I can.
Exactly.
Congratulations on your recent diploma for your research on the medieval painting methods.
Thank you.
That's wonderful.
I'm looking forward to starting, next year. Let's see how it goes.
Please tell our listeners about you and your art, and how did you know that you wanted to focus on classical realism?
I actually fell into classical realism by accident. When I studied fine arts back in the day, so we're talking, I'm still very young, so it wasn't that long ago, but I studied in the late 90s, early 2000s. I graduated in 2002. And back in the day, it was extremely unfashionable to know how to paint. So,
wow.
I know, it's puzzling. It's actually quite silly.
Yes.
But people were being awarded master degrees in painting, and they couldn't actually paint.
Wow.
And that's what universities were doing worldwide. And we're not talking just in the US or in the UK or in Portugal. We're literally talking, it's a worldwide disease. Because of globalization, whatever happens in one place ends up being imitated and taken to other countries as well. And the West fell into this trap. I'm actually quite critical of it. So if you allow me just one minute of venting out in the podcast.
Okay.
But I find that the arts are the only speciality in the world. Let me exaggerate now, just to make a point.
Okay.
The arts became the only speciality in the world where you cannot distinguish the work of a master from the work of an amateur. And I don't know any other speciality where this happens. And yet, when it comes to fine arts, it still prevails. So a lot of the work that we see in fine art galleries is actually not very good. But they seem to run the market. So the market force is behind them. And this brief criticism, because I really don't want to pontificate, but when I studied back then, my teachers were telling me not to paint.
Wow.
And I used to tell them, but painting is the reason why I enrolled in a fine art course, in the first place. The reason why I came to study painting is because I love painting. And there was even a teacher, a professor that used to shout to the class, painting is dead.
Ugh.
And he meant it. And he was the painting professor. How neurotic, So you have painting professors telling their students that painting is worthless and irrelevant, and telling people not to paint. So, making the story short, when I finished my degree, I thought that although I had so many years of history of art, because in Portugal, history of art used to be compulsory also in secondary school. So I had, I don't know, 5 or 6 years in secondary school. I can't remember now. It was a lot. It was like 5 years maybe in secondary school, and then 5 more years at university, because back then courses used to be 5-year long full time. So we're talking 10 years of history of art. And although I had studied 10 years of history of art, I didn't know anything about, let's say, ask me to name 2 or 3 relevant Chinese painters. I have no idea, although they're a quarter of the world's population. And they have a tradition that dates back almost 1,000 years. Tell me to name 2 or 3 relevant Mughal artists, like North Indian miniature painters or Iranian, Persian artists. We have no idea. The truth is that all the artists we revere are essentially white, European or American, but essentially white, male, and they tend to be rich. And when I realized that, I thought I was brainwashed. I thought that my degree took me so far, and I'm grateful that I did learn a lot. I mean, especially in terms of theory, it was a very good course, but it was too Eurocentric and North American based. So I decided to change that. When I finished my studies, first I had to work, to make some money, etc. We don't have student debt in Portugal because universities used to be fully sponsored by the government. So at least that. But I still had to work, especially because my parents were very worried that I would never have a career in my life. When it's the arts, the first thing mom and dad tells you is, "Oh God, do you really have to be an artist?"
Yeah, I've been there. I've been there.
And my brothers, they followed the perfect path. One is a barrister, a lawyer, and the other is an engineer. So I was the black sheep in the family.
I'm in your tribe.
Yeah. So the first thing was to earn some money and work. But as soon as I had some disposable income, I started traveling to learn from masters of different traditions of painting. So I spent 2 months in India studying Indian miniature technique. I lived 3 months in Istanbul to study a technique of marbling, which is called Ebru. It's a very beautiful technique where you tinge the paper with these stains that just look like marble. And it used to be a Persian technique. Then also in London, I took many courses on all the different types of traditional arts. I just wanted to learn about the different traditions from different parts of the world. So I did courses as a student. I studied iconography, lots of things. And as part of my training, I decided to also study 19th century drawing technique from Europe. So the more academic school of painting in Europe before the Impressionists made it in terms of commercial appeal. So we're talking the academic studies, because I adore the drawings from that period. I think that they're the best drawings in history, perhaps. And very underrated, those drawings. And then I also decided to specialize in my love affair in terms of the European tradition is the Flemish oil painting technique from the 15th century. So that transition between the Middle Ages and Renaissance. So I fell into this classical realism by accident. So I felt the need to retrain, to gain skills. And after doing so many courses in different traditions, I finally had to retrain in the Western tradition. And that's how I discovered classical realism.
That's quite a journey that you've been on.
Yes, I spinned and spinned and spinned. It's been a spiral, actually.
Well, your skill level is so incredible. I mean, when you got to the point of doing the classical realism studies, did you find that you were right there with your skills, or did you feel like you really were starting from the ground up? I can't imagine that you were starting from zero, even though they hadn't really prepared you well, as you mentioned.
I'm going to confess something. I don't find my skill. I never feel that it's that good.
Interesting.
Because the strange thing is that the more I evolve in my technique, the more demanding I become.
Oh.
So it's psychoadaptation. You always get used to what you are and who you are.
Yeah.
To you, it's normal. It's like having this. It's like this body odor. You never know it, that you have it, until your friends say something, you know. If you sweat, you don't know you're smelling, you know.
That's a good analogy.
It's the same thing with art. So when I look at my drawings, I like them. I think they're good, but I don't think they're fantastic. And I think in 20 years' time, when I become much, much better than what I am now, I will still be unsatisfied. It's part of us as artists, you know, the further you go, the more you want to journey. And you start realizing that life is too short to actually become truly, truly accomplished. And yeah, so I don't know how to respond to that, because I never thought my technique was that impressive. People around me tell me that. Mm-hmm. But I don't feel it myself at heart, you know, I really don't.
Well, that's a common feeling that I believe that artists share, is this self-critical perfectionism. And in a way, it's a gift, because it keeps us on our toes, so that the more we learn, the more we want to advance, and we want to continually hone our abilities. Now, I have to ask you, your story, I now assume that I know the reason that you burned the Missing series.
Yes.
But can you just tell the listeners briefly what that's about? Because that's a hysterical story. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when your professors saw your presentation, and I would love to know how they received it.
All right. So
it's a good story.
You're making me revive moments that.
Yeah.
So this happened 20 years ago almost. When I was finishing my degree, yeah, that's 15 years ago. Back in the day, because fine art colleges worldwide were attacking technique was considered right-wing. How can I explain this? Beauty and technique back then were considered just a service to the rich. Almost like if you made beautiful art back in the day, you would be accused of serving the oppressor, in the sense that you are decorating someone's palace or someone's church. And so I understand where this whole thing comes from, you know, this attack on technique, because it is true that the art of the past was serving sometimes the wrong people. You know, either abusive kings or emperors, but anyway, it doesn't matter. With modernism, technique is attacked in the 20th century in Europe. I believe the same happened in the States, perhaps. And so when I studied, it was very unfashionable. Like I mentioned before, it was unfashionable to know how to paint. But I always felt that you don't ask a singer to sing out of pitch. Well, a singer might choose to sing out of pitch if they're making, for example, contemporary music, but it should be a choice. No one is a good singer if they sing out of pitch just because they can't sing in pitch. Does this make sense?
Yes.
And the same happens with any art. So, for example, imagine a dancer that can't even keep a position and falls on the ground all the time. That's not dancing. But a professional dancer might choose to throw himself or herself to the ground. That's fine. But never by accident. You know, it shouldn't be a flaw. It shouldn't be a technical flaw. It should be a choice. And the thing that happened with painting is that I was told not to paint. Or if I wanted to paint, I was told to paint ugly, because that was the fashion back then, and it still is the fashion amongst a lot of contemporary art galleries. It has to be ugly. If it's not ugly, it's not art.
Wow.
And so what happened was, I got so upset. I almost quit my course, and I almost quit being a painter, because that really makes you think, these critiques, and that really makes you wonder, what's the relevance of art when you hear every day that art is irrelevant? So I had to make a protest, because I knew that they were wrong. At heart, I knew that they were wrong and I was right. Why? Because at the same time, I've studied at the National Conservatory, part-time, not full-time, but I was studying lyric singing, opera. And in the National Conservatory, it would be absolutely unacceptable not to be able to play an instrument and call yourself a musician. If you don't have the skill, you're not an artist.
Yeah.
This is the classical music perspective. And I thought it's exactly the same with painting. So, I'm making the story too long. Let me shorten it up.
No, I want my listeners to hear this. This is something.
So I really had to make a protest. So what did I do? I painted a series of self-portraits. Has to do with the age. I was in my 20s. It's a stage of self-discovery. I find it was very important to observe myself in the mirror and study myself. So I painted a series of self-portraits, but in the expressionistic way. So I was not interested in realism back then. I was more into expressionism. I used to love Jackson Pollock, Rothko, those
Yes.
painters. And then Van Gogh, and then all those people. So I did paint in that style of bold colors, brush strokes. I used fluorescent colors. I still remember, they glow. The paintings were very bright. I did a series of self-portraits, and then I've decided on the last day of the course, when you are graded, there is an exhibition. You have to show your work. The professors come, and they're going to grade you according to what they see. And when they arrived to grade me, there was nothing. The gallery was empty, and all the spotlights were pointing to one single area in the gallery. It was this wall. So I made all the spotlights converge there. So that bit was very bright. The rest of the gallery was dark. The professors asked me, where is the art? And I replied, it's over there. And I pointed to the area where all the lights were converging. So they approached, and they were very angry when they saw this little black box, because I put a little black box on the wall, and the box was open. And inside the box, there was nothing apart from a little smear of the ashes of the paintings that I had burnt. So as a protest against the university, I thought they only want concepts. Because they were all conceptual. They were anti-painting. They only wanted ideas. They were always telling me that ideas were the thing that matters, not the execution. And I was always debating. I was always saying, no, that can't be right, because otherwise any philosopher, any scientist is probably a better artist than most artists are. It makes no sense, this whole thing that it's the idea that matters. So, of course, ideas matter, but it's the execution that makes the difference between a master painter or just an amateur. So I had to debate this with them. What I told them is, if what matters is ideas, I decided to bring just an idea to the final evaluation. There will be no paintings, just an idea. They went ballistic. They were shouting, they were arguing, and then eventually one of the professors said, no. Suddenly, he changed his mind. After about 3 or 4 minutes of shouting and arguing, they both told me I was immediately going to fail. I had to repeat.
Yeah.
But then after 3 or 4 minutes, one of the professors said, no, this is actually the most daring, the most bold thing I've ever seen in 30 years of lecturing at this university. This guy, he said, deserves the top grade. the top mark. And then the other one said,
Wow.
no, he needs to fail because there is no work to show. And they were arguing. I was just witnessing their argument. I was just silent. And then they asked me, why didn't you photograph or film your performance of you burning the paintings? And I replied, because I didn't want it to look like a traditional performance or traditional photography.
Wow.
So again, all the ideas they were giving me, it's actually very old-fashioned. They were saying that painting is old-fashioned, but then they want me to film or photograph and create a performance. Performance is old-fashioned. It goes back to the Dada movement, from the 20s and 30s. It's 100 years old.
Yes.
So there's nothing radical about it. So everything they were asking me, I was always telling them that I didn't do it because that's too traditional. I just want to bring a pure concept. So the story ended with the university asked me to write a report why I chose to do that. And my grading would be based on that report. I wrote the report. So I ended up having a good grade. And at least I didn't fail. That was my fear. And then after the grade came out, and this is the bit that I would like to tell the listeners that I find the most relevant part of the story. After my grades were out and it was official and I had my degree, I donated one of the paintings to the collection of the university because I actually never destroyed them.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I wanted to prove how easy it is to be a conceptual artist. Anyone can do it. I just faked the whole thing.
You know what would have been interesting if you had videotaped their response to what they thought you did?
I would have loved that.
That would have been an interesting exhibit.
So I still have the missing series.
Wow, so it's not missing. My head is exploding. This is great.
So the whole thing is a fraud on purpose.
It's perfect. And it really gives them back what they were dishing out to you. It really does. Now tell me about the inspiration behind you have a hauntingly beautiful angel iconography series.
Oh, yes.
What inspired you to do that series? Tell me about that.
That series is very important to me because it was through a rough time in my life. I must have been 21 or 22 years old when I painted that series. And I really don't know much of what happened, but I just hit depression. And that depression lasted for almost 4 years. And it doesn't matter what people say, it's just not true. When you have depression, any sort of advice, it's usually not true. Because people say, oh, you have to try this, you have to try that. But sometimes you can't even get out of bed.
That's right.
Yeah, and it goes beyond free will. It really goes beyond free will. It's at another level.
Well, and it's often chemical. I've had that in my life in the past. And you can't just snap out of that.
You can't. I mean, people around you are relevant and they can really help you.
Yeah.
But most of the time, the people around us are not knowledgeable enough to actually deal with it in the correct way. So I painted the Angel series because I felt like I had nobody in my life at all. This vacuum around me, this feeling of absolute solitude and loneliness, mm-hmm. which was like an abyss. Almost like a vertigo feeling at a physical level. I'm talking at a physical level. There would be moments where I would suddenly feel vertigo, like if I was about to fall or something. And it was just me thinking of my life.
Wow.
And how alone I was, how lonely. And I wasn't actually. It was an illusion, but depression makes you feel like that. So thank goodness I'm not a depressive person. That was just an episode of my life. It lasted for a long time, but then it fizzled out. So nowadays I'm absolutely fine. I don't have depression. But during that time, I felt so lonely that I had to paint nocturnal paintings because I've always been attracted to, that hour. It's after sunset, but it's not exactly nighttime yet.
Yes.
It's kind of dusk, but slightly darker than that. And I always thought that hour was magical. There's something quite mystical about the light during that.
You've got to move. You've got to go to Alaska. Alaska has months of that.
Oh, oh my goodness. I never thought of it.
Months
Thank
and
you.
months. It's true.
Thank you.
That's their daytime.
If I go to Alaska and if I paint a whole series,
I want to hear about it.
I would like to offer you my first painting. So
I would be so honored.
But so I had to paint my solitude. So what did I do? I absolutely adore traditional Portuguese architecture. That's something I always loved.
Yeah.
So I painted abandoned cities. It's cityscapes, it's historical centers of cities where I live, places like Lisbon, Leiria, Porto, places where I dwell. But they're abandoned, it's nighttime, there's nobody to be there for you, you're alone, except of perhaps an angel, but even the angel is very hard to grasp. It's usually hidden in the shadows and it's not very visible. Or maybe the angel became a sculpture trapped in stone. So there are images where, for example, I'm painting palaces and houses and everything is ruined. And some of the sculptures, maybe one of the sculptures is glowing in the dark because there is an angel there, but it's trapped in stone. And that absolute loneliness, that solitude, that's what brought me to the Nocturnal Angel series.
Wow, that's beautiful. Well, I will link to those, if you'd like, to that webpage in the show notes so people can see those works that you have on your website.
Thank you. I would love to repaint them again because 20 years later, I feel I could paint them so much better.
Well, and they might have different meaning for you now.
Yes, and it would have a different meaning. And also in terms of skill, because back then I was still learning how to paint. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, I find those images quite strong. They have a certain... I think that when you paint something that is truthful to you,
yeah,
even if the technique is lacking, you always produce a strong piece of art.
I agree with that, and I find them to be very haunting. They're beautiful.
Thank you.
This wraps up part 1 of my interview with Portuguese artist Nelson Ferreira. Join me for part 2 at PassionatePainterPodcast.com, as well as iTunes and the other major podcast directories. If you like what you hear, please hit the subscribe button and never miss an episode. Until next time, go make something.